Sorry for the delay. Welcome to our Zaremski lecture. This is a series of talks that is endowed by an alum of the law school, Miles Zaremski, and his wife, Elena. We are very fortunate today to have with us George Horvath, who is Associate Professor of Law at UCSF. He earned his MD at Temple University and practiced as a cardiologist, and earned his JD at Berkeley, where he served as editor-in-chief of the California Law Review. And after law school, he clerked for Judge John Noonan Jr. on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. His talk today is titled Medical Device Regulation Going from Bad to Worse or Better. We will have information about CLE for those who are attending remotely later. Yes, correct, Eric? We'll have that information for you. And people who are attending remotely, if you have questions, Andrew, how are they supposed to do the questions in the Q&A?
Yeah.
And so, type a question into the Q&A, and if we have time, we'll let you ask them, or we'll read them for you. Okay, everybody understand how we're going to do it? Then please join me in welcoming Professor Horvath.
Thank you for that introduction, Professor Melman, and thanks to everyone at the law school for making this possible. And of course, thanks to Elena and Miles Zaremski for endowing this truly wonderful lecture series. Now that I've had the opportunity to see many of the Zaremski lectures before, it's really an honor to be here speaking with you today. So as Professor Melman mentioned, in my first career, I was a cardiologist. I worked extensively with a lot of high-tech medical devices. Now, as a law professor and legal scholar, I study how FDA regulation is serving its goals of ensuring the safety and effectiveness of devices. And it's undeniable that medical devices have benefited millions of patients, like the devices shown here, all of which either did or promised to radically expand the boundaries of what's considered possible in clinical care. But unfortunately, it's also undeniable that medical devices cause large numbers of injuries and deaths each year, as any trip through the archives of a major news outlet will show you. And to put some numbers on this, in a report from the Government Accountability Office last year, a study using FDA data had concluded that in a recent decade, more than 1.7 million injuries and 83,000 deaths in the United States may have been linked to medical devices. And so, although medical devices tend to get less attention than drugs and vaccines, these products have very large public health impacts, both good and bad. And so in this topic, I want to talk about some of the work that I and others have done, and I want to sort of set this up in three distinct discussions. One is I want to talk about some long-standing problems in ensuring device safety, both from inside the FDA, from the statutes that limit FDA's authority, but also from the medical community itself. And then I'm going to have to engage in a little bit of prognostication, looking at the impact or the likely impact of the policies that we've seen implemented over the past 9 months and what's likely to come. And then I want to talk about what I see as a challenging but not hopeless path forward. And so to begin to frame a discussion about problems of regulating device safety, the first thing that I want to talk about is innovation in the medical device context. And I want to use one set of medical devices to frame this discussion. So before the mid-1980s, physicians really had no safe and effective ways to protect patients who were at risk of sudden cardiac death. These are people whose hearts had a high risk of going into a rhythm that would abruptly cause the heart to stop pumping, and they would essentially die instantly. That all changed in 1985 when the FDA approved the first implantable defibrillator. And what it became possible to do literally overnight was to implant the equivalent of a paramedic unit inside a patient's chest. And that unit would watch the heart rhythm constantly and deliver a life-saving shock when needed. This truly transformed medical practice, but defibrillators need to be connected to the heart, and this is done by a wire that's called a lead. And this wire runs from the defibrillator through the veins to the heart itself. But the lead is actually a very complex medical device consisting of 100 or more components. Um, and manufacturers over the years since the first defibrillator had been approved had developed a large array of leads that were available for clinical use. In 2004, the FDA approved a new lead shown here called the Sprint Fidelis. This lead was much narrower, had a much smaller diameter than earlier leads. We thought that that meant it was less likely to block off veins. Its low profile, its softness made it less likely, we believe, to perforate the heart, which was always a risk. Its complex design allowed us more flexibility in how we could program a defibrillator both to monitor and deliver necessary shocks. These advantages, although they hadn't been studied in clinical trials, seemed quite important, and so many electrophysiologists, many specialists in the field, including myself, began to implant these leads on a routine basis, and in a large enough number that within 2 to 3 years of the approval, nearly 300,000 patients had been implanted with one of these leads. Unfortunately, just 3 years after the device had been approved by the FDA, the manufacturer initiated a series of corrective actions that the FDA soon labeled as a Class 1 recall, which is a label that the FDA applies when there's a problem with the device that causes a reasonable probability of serious adverse health consequences or death. And this was done because these leads were failing much, much more frequently than other leads. And when the lead failed, it would be unable to deliver a life-saving shock when needed. And sometimes it would actually cause the defibrillator to deliver hundreds of shocks when they weren't needed. And so I present these two devices in part to illustrate the benefits and the harms that medical devices can cause, but also to talk about innovation. And we can look at these two products as sitting at opposite poles of a spectrum or a continuum of how innovation takes place in the medical device world. At one pole, we have devices like the first defibrillator that were truly transformative. The transformative innovations are devices that often incorporate new technologies, newly invented technologies, and they really drastically change what's possible in clinical practice. That was the original defibrillators. The Sprint Fidelis lead was not the product of this kind of innovation. Instead, it was the product of a long series of small or incremental changes to an already existing lead that was called the Transvene. All right, the Transvene lead had been approved by the FDA in 1993, and by 2004, the manufacturer had submitted requests to the FDA to make 35 different modifications, which is an average of 2 modifications a year. Each of these individual modifications was small, but cumulatively the changes led to a device that was technologically remote from its original ancestor, the Transvene. Now, when most people think about innovation in the medical device context, they focus on transformative innovations like defibrillators. But the vast majority of innovation in the medical device world and the focus of most of FDA's day-to-day regulatory work is on devices like the Fidelis that are incremental and iterative innovations. And looking at the regulatory pathways that the FDA used to allow devices onto the market, and I'll talk more about these pathways in a moment, you can estimate that about 1% of new devices have been treated by the FDA as though they fall more toward the transformative end of the spectrum on the slide here, which means that 99% of new devices are the result of incremental and highly iterative innovation. And the problem, as I'm going to explain now, is that Congress and the FDA, through a series of choices, have left the FDA with less power to regulate incrementally innovative devices compared with transformative devices. And so let me give you a little bit of background on how medical devices are regulated. So Congress created the modern framework for device regulation in the 1976 Act called the Medical Device Amendments, and it created what's really a unique regulatory framework. Devices are all assigned to a risk class, class 1 or low risk devices, class 2 intermediate risk devices, class 3 or high risk devices, and they're all regulated quite differently. So class 1 devices um, don't receive any pre-market scrutiny by the FDA. The manufacturer has to register with the FDA, but then they can take their devices directly to the market. You can think about class 1 devices as things like bandages and crutches. They account for nearly half of the devices that come to the market each year, but they are low risk. And so we're not going to focus on them today. I'm going to focus on the devices that are in the intermediate and high risk categories, and the ones that likely cause the most harm. And so turning to those devices, if we think about high risk devices, so these are devices that require an extensive pre-market evaluation to ensure their safety. These devices tend to fall toward the transformative side of the innovation spectrum that I described. And these are uncommon. Only about 30 to 35% of devices like this reach the market each year through what's known as the pre-market approval or PMA pathway. And this requires a manufacturer to submit to the FDA an extensive packet of information, often runs to greater than 100,000 pages, typically includes at least one and sometimes more large clinical trials that establish that the device is safe and effective. But once a device reaches the market through this process, a high-risk device reaches the market, it would be very onerous to require a manufacturer to go through that whole rigorous process every time it wanted to modify the device in the slightest way. And so Congress and the FDA have created a series of so-called PMA supplements that allow for modified devices to get approval. These are much less rigorous, much less onerous on the manufacturer. And the decision about whether or not a manufacturer has to submit a new PMA or can use an abbreviated PMA supplement is how different is the new device from the one it's being modified from. If the original data, or at least some significant part of the original data, can still be relied on to support the safety of the device, a PMA supplement is appropriate. And again, these are much faster, much less burdensome on the manufacturer. I'll give you some information about more specific supplements shortly. Every year, about 2,200 PMA supplements receive FDA approval. Now, if we shift and look at the intermediate risk devices, the vast majority of these turn out to be modified versions of devices that are already on the market, modified versions of other intermediate risk devices. These reach the market through what's known as the 510(k) pathway. Under this pathway, the main way that safety and effectiveness are established is through what's called the substantial equivalence requirement. All right, substantial equivalence means that a device has the same intended uses and that the technology is either identical to a device already on the market, called the predicate device, or it can have some different technological characteristics, but those differences are not so great that the FDA would say there's no substantial equivalent here. But notice that under the statutory definition, manufacturers can make significant changes to materials, design, the energy source, and other features. And so what can happen in these devices is a manufacturer can modify an already existing 510(k) device into a new device. It turns out that this is the largest set of devices that come to the market each year. About 76% of new devices that FDA evaluates pre-market go through the 510(k) pathway. And then every year there are a small number of new devices. They're not substantially equivalent. They're not closely related to anything on the market, but they're also arguably not high risk. And for these devices, the manufacturers can use a pathway called the de novo reclassification process. And they can reach the market through the de novo process. But again, this is a small number of devices. These devices tend to fall more toward the transformative side of the innovation spectrum that I described to you. And so this summary of this high-level overview of device regulation shows you a couple of things. One is that the vast majority of devices that are reaching the market each year are treated by the FDA as though they're the products of incremental innovation. And so again, I said close to 99% of devices fit this description. And these devices are regulated under pathways known as PMA supplements and 510K. And so I want to now talk about how the specific features of PMA supplements and 510K pathways can result in unsafe devices reaching the market. And so to supply some sort of an explanation for why 83,000 people may have died and 1.7 million people may have been injured by medical devices over a decade. And so let me start with a problem that has been widely recognized in the medical community and in the legal community as well. And that's the problem that very few devices that are the result of incremental innovation have undergone clinical trials. And so if we look at the far right column here, the numbers that I give show that compared to transformative devices, it's actually quite uncommon for incrementally innovated devices to have been required to provide clinical trial evidence that they're safe and effective. For the class 3 devices, the PMA supplement devices, the 10% is a rough estimate. And I derive that from data in an earlier study that I did and from FDA guidance documents that tell us that there are several PMA supplements, only one of which routinely requires the manufacturer to submit clinical trial evidence that the device is safe. Those are called panel track supplements, and the FDA thinks that they're useful mainly when a manufacturer wants to change or expand the indications of use for a device. And in my data, what I see is that only 1% of all PMA supplements were panel track between 2002 and 2016. The other PMA supplement pathway that's useful for significant modifications are called 180-day supplements, and FDA consider these useful when a manufacturer is making somewhat substantial changes to device technologies. Sometimes 180-day supplements require clinical trials, but often they only require preclinical or bench testing to establish safety. These account for about 30% of all supplements. So the remaining 70% of PMA supplement devices are relatively or very minor modifications to device that were approved under a handful of other supplements. And so what I'm driving at here is that most of the incremental innovation that takes place in class 3 high-risk devices is not evaluated by clinical trials. Now, for incrementally modified class 2 devices, for the 510K devices, as I've already said, the main way that safety is established is through the substantial equivalence requirement. I looked at, in a pilot study, one technology space. I looked at a set of devices that are catheters that are used to remove blood clots in the brains of patients who are having acute strokes. And what I saw in this set of devices that were approved through the 510K pathway were that only about 16% had undergone clinical trials. Earlier reports from the National Academy of Medicine and the Government Accountability Office gave a similar estimate of 8 to 15% of all 510K devices. So clinical trials are rare in incrementally modified devices, and this has attracted a lot of critical attention, and it's led to calls to drastically expand the requirements for manufacturers to conduct clinical trials, and some have even gone so far as to argue that all new devices should undergo clinical trials. But there's an empirical question here, and it may seem absurd to pose, but I'm going to pose it anyway, which is a question. The question is, does having a clinical trial showing a device is safe mean that an incrementally modified device is really safer than a device that didn't have a clinical trial? It would seem obvious, but it's important to keep in mind that the FDA has many, many other tools at its disposal to ensure device safety. The FDA can impose performance standards. It can require certain kind of biocompatibility testing for implanted devices, certain bench testing for artificial joints to make sure that they can bear certain weight loads and bend and flex enough times. The FDA can require manufacturers to adhere to industry standards. The FDA publishes guidance documents that informs manufacturers about expectations and best practices. The FDA can require extensive preclinical requirements. And it's important to recognize that manufacturers also have market-based incentives to make sure that their devices are safe, that they've warned about the risk, and so I think the question is a valid question, right? To what extent do clinical trials contribute to ensuring device safety? So what is the data? Well, for class 3 devices, there isn't really solid data here. Many investigators have criticized the quantity and the quality of the trials that the FDA relied on when it approved new PMA devices. But as far as I'm aware, there isn't any broad-based rigorous assessment of PMA supplement devices and whether devices with clinical trials are safer than devices without clinical trials. For the class 2 devices and the set of devices that I studied, the catheters used to remove blood clots in acute strokes, I did not find a difference in the safety of devices that had had clinical trials compared to devices that had not had clinical trials. And as a marker, I'm looking at devices that are later subjected to a class 1 recall, like the Sprint Fidelis was. And this is a commonly used metric to indicate an unsafe device. Now, the data set here, the size of the data is too small to let me generalize anything. But what this points to is that data that answers some important questions is lacking. And those important questions are, how much do clinical trials contribute to the safety of incrementally innovative devices? In what contexts would clinical trials be most valid? And ultimately, does the FDA need greater authority to require clinical trials for all, or at least for some devices? All right. Now, there's a second feature of both the PMA supplement and the 510(k) pathways that may expose all of us to unsafe devices. And that is that under these pathways, there's no limit to how many times a manufacturer can receive FDA permission to market a modified device. And this was illustrated by the Sprint Fidelis lead that I opened with. Remember that the original Transvene lead had been modified sequentially 35 times as it evolved into the Sprint Fidelis lead. The record holder, as far as I can see, is a defibrillator initially approved in 1998 that has now received 908 approvals for PMA supplements, so has been modified 908 times into an entire family of defibrillators. And so the combination of this unlimited practice of incremental innovation and rare clinical trials being required raises two specific and somewhat opposing concerns. The first that's been commonly recognized, especially in 510(k) devices, is that as devices are modified again and again and again, their technology can evolve from that of a safe ancestor into an unsafe modern-day devices. And this is compounded by the fact that the rarity of clinical trials means that this evolution into something unsafe may not be found. In 510(k) devices, this is known as predicate creep, and it's been discussed quite a bit in the legal and the medical literatures. But as I and some others have argued, because of the similarity in the way PMA supplement devices are regulated, the same process and the same dangers might apply to PMA supplement devices. And so I'm going to use the term technology creep to describe this broader phenomenon. And there's certainly anecdotal evidence that technology creep can lead to compromised device safety. In fact, all of the devices on the slide I showed earlier were the products of incremental innovation and so possibly of technology creep. But it turns out to be extremely difficult to prove that extensive incremental innovation plus a lack of clinical trials leads to unsafe devices in the 510(k) context. And so to prove this, what you would need to do would be to look at devices and ask how many times have they been modified, and does a larger number of modifications correlate with a higher likelihood of undergoing a Class 1 recall? And the reason it's difficult to prove this is that the way 510K devices evolve is quite complex. So this is the data from my catheter study of 510K devices. And what you're seeing here is the evolution of a family of medical devices, starting at the bottom from the very earliest 510K clearances and then moving upward in time. And if you look at devices and you look at the arrows that connect one device to another, this is connecting a new device, the upper device, to all of its predicates or the lower device. And what you see is that many of these devices have a lot of arrows pointing downward, meaning that many devices, in fact, in this database, 56% of devices cited more than one predicate. And for many of these, what's happening is the manufacturers are combining the technologies of two or more devices to create a new device. Those technologies themselves may be safe. We often don't know that because they haven't had clinical trials, but the combination has never been assessed. And so this is concerning, but my main point here is it turns out to be very difficult to figure out what device evolved from what earlier devices. And so proving that technology creep is a problem in 510K devices beyond the anecdotal evidence that we have is quite difficult. For PMA supplement devices, the evolution tends to be more linear and it's easier to study. And so in my earlier study of all PMA and PMA supplement devices that had been on the market between 2002 and 2006, what I was able to see is that when manufacturers made somewhat significant changes, so changes that were approved through the panel track and 180-degree supplements, the devices that had been more frequently modified were nearly 3 times as likely to be recalled compared to the other devices. And I apologize for not having the p-value here. The difference in the left-hand comparison is 0.02, right? So a statistically significant finding. And most of that difference is driven by one subset of devices, cardiovascular devices, where the difference is a 5-fold difference. Devices that had been most frequent, cardiovascular devices that had received the largest number of PMA supplement approvals were about 5 times more likely to be recalled than all the other devices. And the p-value there is less than 0.01. And so we have at least some data that technology creep is a real danger, but that it may be more common in PMA supplement devices, although that remains to be proven, and that even there, the scope of the danger may be limited to certain subsets of devices, and that's going to be important as we formulate reform proposals. The second concern that's raised by unlimited innovation plus rare clinical trials is what I refer to as the bad predicate effect. And this is the opposite, where an unsafe technology can reach the market through any pathway that you want to talk about. And then that device can be incrementally modified. But because the incremental modifications are small, the unsafe aspect of the technology may not be touched for 1 generation, 2 generations, for several generations. And so the unlimited nature of incremental innovation that's permitted under these pathways may allow unsafe technologies to propagate down several generations of new devices. And my study in the PMA context seems to confirm this, that devices that had been recalled, if you look at the devices that are modified versions, later devices that were modified versions of a recalled device, compare that to the descendants of devices that had never been recalled. There's about a 3-fold difference, a 3-fold higher likelihood that the devices that are derived, that are modified versions of recalled devices, are themselves going to be recalled. I get similar findings in my 510K data set, where devices that were modified versions of recalled devices were about 3 times as likely themselves to be recalled. Now, that study did not achieve statistical significance. It was a much smaller data set, but just looking at a graphic presentation of how these devices evolve, you can see the way one unsafe technology may lead to a second unsafe device and then a third unsafe device is shown in the red circles. And so we have at least some evidence that both technology creep and the bad predicate effect may allow unsafe devices to reach the market. And so even if a lack of clinical trials by itself or the process of the permission of unlimited numbers of modifications under the PMA supplement and 510(k) pathways by themselves don't allow unsafe devices onto the market, these features can act synergistically to allow unsafe devices to reach the market. So let me now talk about some other reasons why we may be exposed to unsafe devices. So next is that FDA really has limited capacity to conduct post-market regulation. This has been known for a long time. We've long known that when manufacturers are required by law to conduct post-market studies on drugs, biologics, and devices, those studies are typically completed late and often not completed at all. And recent work in the device space by others has shown that fewer than 10 to 15% of required post-market studies on medical devices had been completed. And quite simply, the FDA lacks the resources to aggressively oversee this. Second is that it turns out to be very difficult for the FDA to remove at least some dangerous devices from the market. This is particularly salient in the 510(k) device context, where the process required is extremely complex and research intensive. There was a family of devices known as surgical mesh devices. They were used for a number of reasons, including pelvic floor reconstructive surgery. It turned out that these devices were inflicting wide ranges and large numbers of harm. And for some of these devices, it took the FDA at least 7 years to remove them from the market. And so we now have problems that allow unsafe devices to reach the market. We have problems that allow unsafe devices to remain on the market, but none of this would be a problem if large numbers of patients were exposed to new and unsafe devices. At least it wouldn't be a problem of great magnitude. Which brings me to the third factor that I want to discuss, and that's the clinical practice by physicians. And what we see is that physicians now very rapidly adopt new technologies. It's true in the drug context, and it's true in the device context as well. I described to you how rapidly those of us in the field of heart rhythm treatment adopted the Sprint Fidelis lead in 2004. We see the similar things happening with new prosthetic joints, metal on metal hip joints like the ASR hip prosthesis, where more than 60,000 people in the United States alone received one of these in a 2-year period between the approval of the device and the market withdrawal because of the extensive problems that the device was causing. And we see this in neuro and spinal surgery as well, where surgeons very rapidly adopted a new kind of spinal fusion device, the Infuse system. And between 2002 and 2011, implanted 500,000 of these devices. And I will point out that just in the first year or two after this device was approved, spinal surgeons had started using these products extensively and often off-label. And my point here is that this pattern of rapid adoption means that physicians are using devices and implanting devices well before they have a good understanding of the full spectrum of the risks that those devices pose. So I promised to engage in a little prognostication, and so it's time to do that. And I do need to talk about what's been happening with the policies and implementations in the last 9 months. And What's happened in the last 9 months, especially in the context of drugs and vaccines, have led some people to talk in dark, really, if not apocalyptic terms. Former FDA Commissioner Robert Califf posted on his LinkedIn account in early April that the FDA, as we've known it, is finished. And this was largely in response to the first round of reductions in force, the first large cuts to FDA personnel. Now, in the device context, we haven't seen the kind of ideologically based problems or effects that we've seen in the vaccine context. But like the rest of the FDA, the Center for Devices and Radiologic Harm, or Radiologic Health, which conducts the medical device regulation, has been hit by the ongoing reductions in force. And the numbers of cuts at CDRH are unclear, but we know that at least 10% of the staff were terminated in the April reduction in force. Some of those folks were rehired. We know there's been a second round of reductions. I believe that was in August. And there's been an ongoing drip, drip, drip of departures, including many senior leaders with decades of experience leaving. So it's somewhat surprising that as yet we're not seeing a slowdown in CDRH's ability to complete its pre-market regulatory work. And so I've looked at the rate at which devices are being cleared or approved for the market. The graph on the upper left shows 510K clearances. We have not seen a drop off over compared to previous years from January to March, from April to September. So it appears that 510K clearances are continuing apace. The other three plots show the amount of time it's taking the CDRH to evaluate and allow devices onto the market for de novo, for PMA, and for PMA supplement devices. And again, we're not seeing a drop off below the sort of historically observed fluctuations in how long it takes. But it's possible that that's because many of these devices were already fairly far along the regulatory process. And so it's possible that we'll start to see slowdowns. But it's also possible that CDRH's performance has remained steady because a lot of those activities, a lot of CDRH's pre-market regulatory activity is funded by user fees paid by device makers. And so under the device user fee program that Congress created in 2002 in a statute called the Medical Device User Fee and Modernization Act, or MDUFMA, right? Every time a manufacturer submits a device to the FDA for approval or clearance, it has to pay a fee. And the agreement is that those fees will go almost entirely toward funding FDA's pre-market regulatory work, with the idea that the funds will speed the evaluation and allow manufacturers to get their devices to the market more quickly. And to some extent, this program insulates CDRH's pre-market regulatory work from the ongoing reductions in force. But even if I'm correct about that, there's real reason to worry about CDRH's ability to conduct post-market regulation because those functions and the staff required to do it are not supported by user fees. And so to sum up everything that I've said so far, right, the FDA regulation of incrementally innovative devices, again, 99% of devices under the PMA supplement and 510K pathways, right, leads to the underproduction of clinical trials, which may allow unsafe devices to reach the market. It allows unlimited incremental innovation that can allow unsafe devices to evolve through technology creep. It may allow unsafe devices to propagate their unsafe features down to future generations of devices. FDA's ability to deal in the post-market period with unsafe devices, to identify them, remove them from the market, has long been limited and will probably grow even more limited in the face of ongoing reductions in force. And physicians have been adopting new technologies very rapidly. And I think that all of these factors work synergistically to expose tens or even hundreds of thousands of patients to potentially dangerous new technologies each year. And so I want to briefly talk about some potential ways to move forward. And I really do see this time as challenging, but not entirely hopeless. And so I want to offer three different piecemeal and ultimately unsatisfying ways that we might be able to address at least some of these problems. And so the first general suggestion is, as many have suggested, we just need to expand FDA's authority. For example, make it easier for the FDA to remove dangerous devices from the market. Or, as many has suggested, to expand FDA's authority to require clinical trials for many more new devices, many more devices coming through the 510(k) and the PMA supplement pathways. Again, this is going to require, most of this would require an act of Congress, right? This is going to require statutory changes to the medical device amendments. And because it's going to be exceedingly difficult to do that right now, I think the goal at this point should be for folks like me to assemble as broad and solid an empirical evidence base about when clinical trials would be most helpful, right? Under what circumstances they could be most helpful in order to target intervention, to target FDA's expanded authorities and put forth proposals that can basically sit on the shelf until we can hope to get those legislated. A second approach is to look for ways that might insulate FDA's functions and really to decouple what the FDA is required to do from executive branch policies and congressional inaction. And so one way that we might be able to do that is by turning to third parties to conduct some of FDA's functions. There's long been programs like a third-party review by accredited private entities that are used for simple 510(k) clearances. So a subset of 510(k) submissions can be farmed out to accredited private entities that can decide whether or not a device merits clearance, should be available to go to the market. I've always been somewhat cynical about this because what I've seen is that the FDA has, over the last 50 years of device regulation, developed an incredibly broad and deep expertise in this field that could not be rivaled by private entities. But now, with the reductions in force, as more and more people are leaving the agency for the private sector, this may become more appealing. Right, another possibility might be to try to expand the user fee program for devices and use some of the expanded funds to support FDA's post-market activity to help the FDA police devices that are already on the market. And it turns out that the current generation of this device user fee program under what's known as MDUFMA 5 is going to sunset in September of 2027. And so FDA is now beginning the process of formulating the next user fee program, what's going to be called MDUFMA 6. And I think it would be worth considering whether we should try to expand the user fee program and use the funds to help to support CDRH's work on ensuring the safety of devices that are already on the market. And then finally, I think that we need to think beyond the FDA about ways to keep devices safe. So one thing that we can think of is looking at state products liability law as a regulator. We know, or at least we believe, that products liability law, tort law in general, can incentivize the production of safer devices, the provision of more robust warnings. Um, I've looked at the role that state products liability law can play in terms of enhancing device safety. Products liability law is limited in large part by federal preemption doctrine, but also by some internal doctrinal aspects in tort law. If you have any exposure to what's known as Comment K from the Second Restatement of Torts, what you have seen there is a liability shield that in the last 2 decades has been increasingly used by courts to shield device makers from liability for their defective devices. And I think it may be worthwhile reconsidering the Comment K rule. And then the other idea that you can talk about, that I can talk about right now, it focuses on physician practices of rapidly adopting new technologies. And I think that those of us now on the law side of things, right, have a lot to offer medical practitioners, trainees, thought leaders, enabling them or helping them to understand the limitations in device regulation, like the ones I've talked about here, and how the choices, right, how their choices to rapidly adopt new technologies might exacerbate the problems that already exist. And so I want to stop there. I apologize. I know there's only a few minutes for Q&A, but I would love to hear any comments or questions. So I'm going to stop the screen sharing and look forward to hearing from you.
Do we have any questions from the audience in person? We have any questions from the remote audience? We have time for just a couple, but thank you very much, George. It was excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Michael Morley, who asks, what percentage of incrementally modified devices that do not undergo clinical trials actually cause injuries? It seems to me that increasing the clinical trial requirement might keep useful and safe devices off the market or delay their introduction, with detrimental effects on the people who could have benefited from those devices.
Yeah, great question. And so let me give two responses to that. First of all, as an empirical matter, I think the answer is unknown at this point. I think that we need to do a lot of empirical work. It turns out to be difficult to do this at scale. It's easier, I believe, in the 510(k) devices because the FDA in their publicly available data tells us which 510(k) devices have clinical trials as part of their 510(k) clearance submission. It's more difficult in the PMA and PMA supplement world. PMA devices, we know are going to have clinical trials in almost all cases. The supplements, it's more difficult. And I hope to engage in some of that work in the near future. In terms of the likelihood that increasing clinical trials would have adverse effects on innovation, absolutely. And so part of the reason that I want to work on how to target the requirement for clinical trials to limited circumstances is trying to balance those concerns. But I would also suggest that clinical trials, requiring clinical trials, regulating for safety is not necessarily anti-innovation. And so one thing I would suggest is that clinical trials produce what people like Rebecca Eisenberg have described as a valuable resource, right? Because doing these clinical trials helps future device developers understand what technologies are safer, what technologies are more effective, and it may provide a knowledge base that helps to channel innovation in a future direction.
I think we were kind of out of time, so unfortunately, even though we probably have more questions, for CLE, Eric, what is the?
It's in the chat.
Okay, so in the chat, if you want CLE credit, go to the chat and you will see some information on how to get that. If I think that wraps up our excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Coming up next week, I believe, but we'll send more information about that out. Thank you so much. Thanks, Stefan.
I always like second impact on that too. I can see that. Yes.
Taking some notes.
Thank you. Oh, you just got it.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah,
Maybe.
there's something about that, like, it's, so.
Yeah. But you.
Yeah. Yeah, would make this, yeah, I understand she'll be in person, but we'll still need to have the Zoom up for the people who are joining via the webinar. Yeah. So So that's next Tuesday.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can I send you what I do with Patty? I don't go online and do CLE, but I'd like to get CLE. I'll send you my email with my attorney number.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you both. I've got to go to a meeting.
Okay, real quick, well, once next week, the same thing, would you prefer like box lunches, it's about the same?
Let's do box lunches just for today.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay,
Great.
thank you so much.
Already.
Okay.
So boxes for next week.
Next week,
Yeah.
and I will have you the co-host, because next week I cannot be here. Or I could,
Understood.
so
Yeah.
I'll make sure you're the co-host, and
Great.
you know how to log on. So,
I mean, I think so. I wasn't able to. If I get the link in advance, then I'll be able to do it. So maybe
Yeah.
I should just contact Martin Esca. Is that right?
I'll contact him and copy you on it,
All right, great.
and then,
Take care.
thank you. And then next weekend, Rob would definitely be here since it's in person.
Okay, great.
So you just go to Rob and you just have to log in, so,
Alrighty, great.
yeah, and do the same thing.
All right, great. Yeah, thank you, Eric. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
Hi, thank you for putting this together. I was wondering if Dr. Bovarth has a preferred email address for follow-up questions regarding the presentation, or if there's one definitely not.
Take a look. I have it on the event one, but I bet that you can just email him.
His UC email probably.
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be okay.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you very much. Have a nice afternoon.
Take care. Yeah, it's on the UC Law website for that UC Law.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you. Right, thank you.
Need any more lunch before you go?
You know, I'm looking at it, I'm not hungry.
Fair enough.
Have problem with free food.
I know what you mean. Yeah, should we just move that out to the rotunda or something?
Exactly, let me just get something.
Alrighty. Creative.
Someone line.
Let's do a dry ingredients
Yeah,
first, actually.
sandwiches label.
Oh, yeah, right. That first one was deep shawarma.
Yeah.
Right.
Chicken and beef.
foods.